More than 100 new taxes are now being developed under the umbrella of curbing greenhouse gases. The new taxes will be paid directly to the private bank consortium. At the producer level, taxes will be paid on farm animals' flatulence. At the consumer level, there will be carbon taxes on all forms of meat, beef, poultry, pork, and fish. All cars will be fitted with satellite tracking boxes that will tax driving by the mile. And an added tax will be placed on all fossil fuels, including motor oil and natural gas. All plastic products will have a carbon tax added. Outdoor space heaters and fireplaces are to be taxed. All electricity produced by coal-powered plants will be taxed. Under the cap-and-trade system, citizens will be forced to pay taxes on thousands of products to private cap-and-trade services owned by Al Gore and other elitists. There will be taxes on light bulbs, water, trash pickup, air travel, train travel, bus, ship, medicine, steel production, mining, clothing, laundry, asphalt are just a few of the new taxes to be levied.
But to truly transform our economy, to protect our security and save our planet from the ravages of climate change, we need to ultimately make clean, renewable energy the profitable kind of energy. So I ask this Congress to send me legislation that places a market-based cap on carbon pollution and drives the production of more renewable energy in America. That's what we need.
The notion of anthropogenic global warming is a fraud. In other words, the idea that the planet is getting warmer and that human activity is somehow responsible is a pseudo-scientific fraud. It's a big lie. It's a monstrosity. Remember the Nazis, they had race science, race hygiene. They said Aryan blood is different from any other kind of blood. This was, of course, idiocy, a fantastic piece of nonsense. Today, we've got something similar. Global warming caused by human activity, and the answer to that is carbon tax plus cap and trade, according to the wishes of Al Gore, Prince Charles, and basically the entire world banking community, the world oligarchy. What they're trying to do with that is to perpetuate the current system where bankers rule the world, financiers rule the world, and the rest of us get the crumbs from the table. But remember, if you try to put on cap and trade and a global warming carbon tax with the idea that you're going to save the polar bears, what you're going to do is destroy human society. You're going to cause genocide on a massive scale. The deaths will be measured in the hundreds of millions and indeed in the billions. Just the idea of global warming means that there'll be no development for Africa, no development for the poorer parts of Southeast Asia, and no world economic recovery of any kind ever in our entire lifetime. So it's important to expose and fight the pseudo-scientific fraud of global warming. One more point about this. You don't need a climatologist to know that this stuff is a fraud. I'm a historian. I can tell you, in the last 1,000 years, we had a period of very warm temperatures called the medieval warm period, where all kinds of grapes and semi-tropical stuff was growing very far into the northern hemisphere. That was about 1100, 1200. It happened to correspond with an all-time maximum of sunspots. Right now, we can say that we're going into another maximum period where there'll be some warming, but we're well within the limits of the medieval warm period. About 1600 to 1650, there was an ice age in northern Europe. The North Sea was filled with ice. The German and Dutch ports and the English ports were filled with ice. That corresponds to an all-time minimum of sunspot activity, the Spörer minimum and the Maunder minimum. So this has largely got to do with solar activity. We can see that other planets, not just the Earth, are warming slightly as a result of increased solar activity. But we're well within the minimum. So what the oligarchs claim to be an open and shut scientific case is a piece of pseudo-scientific nonsense, and it should be rejected.
When people say we don't believe in global warming, I say, no, I believe in global warming. I don't believe that human CO2 is causing that warming.
A few years ago, if you would ask me, I would tell you it's CO2. Why? Because just like everyone else in the public, I listened to what the media had to say.
Volcanoes produce more CO2 each year than all the factories and cars and planes and other sources of man-made carbon dioxide put together. More still comes from animals and bacteria, which produce about 150 gigatons of CO2 each year, compared to a mere 6.5 gigatons from humans. An even larger source of CO2 is dying vegetation, from falling leaves, for example, in the autumn. But the biggest source of CO2 by far is the oceans.
Because ruminants in the rumen don't have access to oxygen, they need to produce a different range of end products. And one of the key ones from the rumen is methane. When you compare with carbon dioxide, methane is 21 times more potent.
The artificial manipulation of the Earth's climate, also called geoengineering. During the meeting, scientists spoke about the plausibility of implementing geoengineering campaigns throughout the world under the guise of preventing global warming.
Going back 50 years, there's been countless climate manipulation, weather modification programs that the vast majority of the public is completely unaware of. And if they think that this is not true, that certainly that somehow they would have known if it was occurring, I would ask them to look at things like Agent Orange and the things that governments do because they can, because there's no one to stop them, because they have these huge military machines that want to control everything. And in fact, the government's own document, perhaps you may have seen, it's available to any online, is called Owning the Weather, an express goal of our government, and not just our government.
He told the Associated Press that the American government has created weather tampering techniques so that the New World Order will be able to starve millions of Americans and to control the rest.
Of course, it's getting in the environment, and of course, it's weakening the plants, and it takes a couple years for this to actually weaken the plant. So we are asking for GMO taro, we're asking for GMO papaya, because we can't grow our natural seeds. We can't be sustainable. We can't truly, be here as God created us to be.
Industry that's being built up to milk the taxpayers by undergoing some kind of a giant global spraying program to make all kinds of money on the project, and they don't seem to care really what effect it has. They're not trying to experiment to see if humans can survive it or anything like that. They just want to get this stuff up. And then we discover, as we're going further down the line, that there are companies generating genetically modified organisms, seeds, modified seed crops they're being engineered to resist the aluminum in the soil. And a lot of crops won't grow in that. And so now, after they've messed up the soil, all the farmers were going to have to go back and buy seeds that have been genetically engineered to resist the aluminum that have been put into the soil. And all of a sudden, mankind is completely dependent upon these companies like Monsanto and other giant agricultural firms. You can't even grow natural seeds anymore.
Monsanto. For 20 years I've traveled the globe, and everywhere I've heard about this American multinational. But what I've heard hasn't always been positive. Wanting to know more, I surfed the web for months to put the pieces of the puzzle together. On its website, Monsanto positions itself as an agricultural company that aims to help farmers produce healthier food while reducing agriculture's impact on our environment. Its leading product is Roundup, the world's best-selling herbicide for the last 30 years.
One shot, all it takes for weeds, Roundup.
Monsanto is also the world leader in biotechnology. 90% of the GMOs grown on the planet belong to them. Most of them have been genetically modified to resist the application of Roundup, like Roundup Ready soybeans. Monsanto's GMOs have invaded the planet, but no ag industry product in history has ever incited as much controversy and passion. Why? What's at stake with GMOs? And could the company's past shed some light on what the company is or claims to be today? Founded in St. Louis, Missouri in 1901, it was not always an agricultural company. It was one of the largest chemical companies of the 20th century.
Chemistry is working for you, and very likely Monsanto is working for you. Monsanto, where creative chemistry works wonders for you.
The wonders boasted about in this commercial made Monsanto one of the most controversial companies in the industrial era. Agent Orange, aspartame, bovine growth hormone, PCBs. These chemically created oils used worldwide as coolants and lubricants in electrical equipment were the jewels in Monsanto's crown for over 50 years. They were called Arachlor in the United States, Pyrrolin in France, and Clofen in Germany, until they were banned in the early 1980s. Monsanto PCB. A Washington Post article from 2002. Monsanto hid decades of pollution. It happened in Anniston, Alabama.
See this grass right here? They buried PCBs over here. Monsanto got permission to bury PCBs in Anniston. And this is Snow Creek right here, where they put the cement in here. It comes from the plant discharging to PCBs all the way down through here. And it was poisoning. They never told anybody, but they told the state. The state didn't tell us.
PCB Monsanto knew, but what exactly did they know? An environmental organization in Washington, D.C., headed by Ken Cook, has put internal Monsanto files online. Most of them are classified confidential. FYI and destroy. 1937, exposure to PCBs provokes systemic toxic effects and acne-form skin eruption. In 1961, 2 workers developed hepatitis symptoms after a pipe broke in a factory using PCBs. In 1966, Monsanto scientists placed fish in Snow Creek's water. All were dead in 3.5 minutes. Pollution, a letter addressed to sales executives in 1970.
This is the one that really tells you the story. They're saying, we can't afford to lose $1 of business. Their neighbors in Anniston were not told about the poisoning that they were inflicting upon them because they didn't want to lose $1. It was only when lawyers went to court on behalf of people in Anniston and forced the company through the legal system to disclose these internal secret documents that we knew what they knew. They knew the truth from the very beginning. They lied about it. They hid the truth from their neighbors. They hid the truth, in many cases, from the government authorities. And when they did share information with government authorities that should have been acted upon, the government authorities, instead of siding with the people who were being poisoned, sided with the company. They sided with Monsanto. It was outrageous, absolutely unforgivable.
That's a horrible story. But what do scientists think about it? On the web, you can find numerous articles concerning the effects of PCBs on human health. David Carpenter is one of the most qualified specialists in the field. He carried out the testing for the Anniston residents.
We all have PCBs in our bodies. The polar bears and the penguins have PCBs. And what has happened is in the past, There were a few sites where PCBs were released, but over time they've gone into the air, they've gone into the water, they've transported, so the whole world is now contaminated with PCBs. The issue is that many diseases are caused by PCB exposure. The one everyone knows about is cancer.
My test results stated that I had 202 parts per billion in my system.
Women that get pregnant and have PCBs in their body will have a child with a reduced IQ.
29.6.
PCBs cause reduced thyroid function.
Over 1,800.
PCBs interfere with sex hormones.
Pass away, just let me pass away. Pass away in peace. He's gonna pay, I said then. He's gonna pay for the way that he has done to us.
In 2001, 20,000 Anniston residents filed 2 lawsuits against Monsanto. Monsanto and its subsidiary, Solutia, settled by paying $700 million to compensate the victims, to clean up the site, and to build a specialized hospital. But no Monsanto executive was ever sued.
To do justice. Under American law, in most instances, it's very rare for executives or officials in these companies to be held criminally responsible. So we have the civil system, the civil courts. We make them pay. And the truth of the matter is, in most instances, the price these companies pay decades later is a fraction of their profits. And this is why it pays to keep these problems secret. And it makes you wonder what they might be keeping secret now. I have to say, we would never trust a company like Monsanto to tell the truth about a pollution problem or about a product. We would never trust them.
Ken Cook says we would never trust a company like Monsanto. So what about Roundup, the world's favorite herbicide used by gardeners and farmers alike? What is it exactly? It's the brand name Monsanto gave to glyphosate, a so-called non-selective or total herbicide because it destroys all plants. First sold in 1974, it owes its great success to Monsanto's unwavering claims that it is biodegradable and good for the environment.
Voici Roundup, le premier désherbant biodégradable. Il détruit les mauvaises herbes de l'intérieur jusqu'aux racines et ne pollue ni la terre ni l'os de Rex. Roundup, le désherbant qui donne envie de désherber.
Roundup biodegradable. Ken Cook was right. The company was found guilty of false advertising. Twice. The first time was in New York in 1996. And the second was in France just last year. The judges found that the wording biodegradable leaves the soil clean and respects the environment were false advertising. Especially since, according to tests performed by Monsanto itself, only 2% of the product had broken down after 28 days. That's why Monsanto recently removed the word biodegradable from its containers. But that's not all. Many scientific studies have shown that Roundup is highly toxic.
I found in the early years I was involved in the regulation of biotechnology that there was a general feeling in agribusiness and inside our government in the U.S. that if you weren't marching lockstep forward in favor of rapid approvals of biotech products, rapid approvals of GMO crops, then somehow you were anti-science and anti-progress. Well, I think that, frankly, there were a lot of folks in industrial agriculture who didn't want as much analysis as probably we should have had because they had made a huge amount of investments in the product. I mean, I think that, and certainly when I became secretary, given the fact that I was in charge of the department regulating agriculture, I had a lot of pressure on me not to push the issue too far, so to speak. But I would say even when I opened my mouth in the Clinton administration, I got slapped around a little bit by not only the industry, but also some of the people even in the administration. In fact, I made a speech once where saying that we needed to more thoughtfully think through the regulatory issues on GMOs. And I had some people within the Clinton administration, particularly in the U.S. trade area, that were very upset with me. They said, how could you in agriculture be questioning our regulatory regime?
In a nutshell, in the United States, the Secretary of Agriculture doesn't stand a chance against the multinationals.
The reason why GM crops are here is based on a deception that occurred in the FDA. They said that these foods are not different. They use the word substantially equivalent. They use the word not meaningfully or uniformly different. And what that turned into was a terminology called generally recognized as safe, or GRAS. Typically, if something is to be considered generally recognized as safe, it needs lots of peer-reviewed published studies and an overwhelming consensus among the scientific community. With GM crops, they had neither.
Trying to say that these things should be considered food additives. When you want to put a new coloring agent in a food, the tiniest bit of coloring agent or a preservative or some other tiny chemical, that's considered a food additive, and you have to go through all these procedures to show it's that it meets the criterion of reasonable certainty of no harm. But when you genetically engineer a food which can cause untold differences in that plant, they don't require anything.
Here in Washington, if you were to have an evening and go out and get a drink at one of the local haunts where all the lobbyists hang out, everybody would laugh about this. They all know this was a joke, this substantial equivalency. This was simply a way to paper over the need for these companies, especially Monsanto, to move their products into the environment quickly with the least amount of government interference. And I should say they were very, very good at getting their interest expressed. I have never seen a situation where one company could have so much overwhelming influence at the highest levels of regulatory decision-making as the example of Monsanto with its GM food policy in the government.
From a corporate standpoint, it was a brilliantly executed takeover.
Early on, a gentleman by the name of Michael Taylor became the deputy administrator of the Food and Drug Administration right at the time that they were about to set out their policy.
He moved over to the FDA in July of 1991. Up until that time, he was at a law firm called King & Spalding. His personal clients included not only Monsanto, but the International Food Biotechnology Council. And he had drafted for them a proposal for how they would like to see genetically engineered foods regulated. And if you look at the proposal that was written for IFBC, that was Michael Taylor's, with the final one that was published, it looks very, very similar. So if he didn't write it, it looks like somebody took what he wrote and changed it slightly for the policy.
Mr. Taylor was the deputy commissioner at the time, and he provided the leadership for the project and served as the chief, the sort of the lead policy person in terms of making sure that the project got done.
So Monsanto played that game very well, both the political game and the regulatory game. They played a key role in bovine growth hormone in getting that thing approved, and also in how genetic engineering was dealt with.
Michael Hansen has just mentioned bovine growth hormone. What's that? It's a transgenic hormone that's injected into cows, increasing dairy production by 20%. It would be an understatement to say that it had critics. The hormone threatens our health. Deadly poison. Manipulation. Called RBGH for recombinant bovine growth hormone, Monsanto began selling it to dairy farmers in 1994 under the brand name Posilac.
Posilac is the single most tested new product in history. You'll soon see the dramatic results Posilac can offer you.
In 1985, Monsanto submitted Posilac to the FDA for market approval. The experts at the FDA's Center for Veterinary Medicine reviewed the studies that the company had carried out on experimental herds. At the FDA, the veterinarian in charge of reviewing the data was Richard Burroughs. In an interview, he stated that agency officials had suppressed and manipulated data.
The data that they came in with lacked a lot of insight into the dairy industry. They didn't ask crucial questions about these diseases, and that is mastitis, which is infection of the mammary gland, and reproductive problems. So when the first data came in and that was missing, I said, all right, guys, you need to go back and get information. So that set it back probably 2 or 3 years.
Did you warn the FDA about your concerns?
They pretty much just sidetracked me. They pulled in, my boss pulled in other people that were closer to him, and I saw less and less of the data. Even the things I had asked for to be done, I didn't, like the mastitis studies, I never really got to see a lot of that because they figured, well, if you're in the way, we'll get you out of the way. So they sidetracked me. Eventually I was fired. One day I was escorted to the door and told that was it. I was done.
Have you been threatened?
Yes, mainly by the lawyers for Monsanto, because when I was going for my appeal, they told my lawyer that if I went in and revealed any company secrets in my defense, that they would sue me.
In the end, the FDA was forced to reinstate this conscientious veterinarian. He eventually resigned, disheartened. On the internet, there's also talk about files that were stolen from the FDA and sent to Dr. Samuel Epstein, who heads the Cancer Prevention Coalition. In 1990, Samuel Epstein published an article in The Milkweed, the standard for dairy reporting, edited by Pete Hardin. The scoop was based on the secret documents that the two men scrutinized.
One morning, I came in, I think in October of that year, I came into my office and found a great big box of documents. And it came from Washington, but no indication as to who sent it. This was a box of files of all Monsanto records which had been submitted to the FDA on the veterinary tests in the preceding 6 years or so. Well, this was great fun.
Many of these documents are original documents, and as it says here, company confidential. It contains confidential information which may not be reproduced, revealed to unauthorized persons, or sent outside the company without proper authorization. As an investigative journalist, that's the kind of stuff I like to report. Revealing this information made Monsanto and FDA very, very angry, because what we were able to establish is that there were dramatic physiological changes in the animals that received the shot, the hormone shots, compared to their control group peers. For example, we see the ovaries of the cows receiving the synthetic hormone in the different treatment groups were, for the right ovaries, 34% larger, 42% larger, and 44% larger. Elsewhere in the stolen files, it shows how there were severe problems with the reproduction of these treated animals.
For Monsanto, the hormone is not only safe, it is actually beneficial for consumers. Because the chemical composition of the milk is not altered as a result of Posilac, the manufacturing and taste properties do not change.
It's untrue or lie, whatever adjective you want to use. It's a very different product. It's a very, very different product in many, many ways. First of all, as there's a high incidence of mastitis in the cows, there'll be pus in the milk. And then you'd find antibiotics given to the cows to treat the mastitis. So a wide range of antibiotics would be in the milk. Apart from that, and very, very importantly, very substantial increases in levels of IGF-1, or insulin-like growth factor 1. There have been a series of studies, somewhere in the region of 60, relating increased levels of IGF-1 and breast, colon, and prostate cancers.
Lawyer Stephen Drucker represents a coalition of nonprofit associations. He sued the FDA, forcing it to declassify its internal files on GMOs.
We received over 44,000 pages from the FDA's own files, and they revealed that the FDA has been lying to the world since 1992, if not before. But they continue to lie. They are still lying. They claim that there's an overwhelming consensus in the scientific community that genetically engineered foods are as safe as their conventionally produced counterparts. And they claim that there has been sufficient data to back up this consensus. Both of those claims are blatant lies. Before the consistent warnings in the memos from the FDA's own scientists, the FDA had very clear warning because the very first genetically engineered food supplement that came to market in the United States caused a major epidemic.
Do you remember what happened in '89 with L-tryptophan? You remember?
Yes.
It was a bioengineered amino acid. We know very well what's amino acid and...
Right.
That killed dozens of people and made hundreds and hundreds sick.
It caused an epidemic of an unusual disease called EMS.
Right.
And how many people died?
Right, but we have many...
37. And more than 1,000 people disabled. You remember?
I do remember.
And you said, according to FDA administrative record, we do not yet know the cause of EMS, nor can we rule out the engineering of the organism. Did you say that I read?
Yes.
If I type in Monsanto falsified scientific studies, I get 174,000 hits. Among them, a report from the EPA of the United States. Monsanto accused of falsifying studies concerning the carcinogenicity of dioxin. The story began in Nitro, in a Monsanto factory that produced a powerful herbicide called 2,4,5-T. In 1949, an explosion in the factory provoked unexpected side effects. 228 workers developed an extremely disfiguring illness called chloracne. It's caused by dioxin, which is a highly toxic byproduct of 2,4,5-T. T was the main ingredient in Agent Orange, the defoliant used by the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. During the war, 40 million liters of Agent Orange, containing 400 kilograms of pure dioxin, were sprayed on trees in southern Vietnam. 3 million people were contaminated, including thousands of American soldiers. Even some 40 years after the end of the war, dioxin continues to claim more victims. We know today that this poison provokes cancer and serious genetic malfunctions. In 1978, while American Vietnam veterans were suing the makers of Agent Orange, Monsanto sponsored studies on the long-term effects of dioxin. The company paid scientists to compare the health of workers who had been exposed during the nitro plants accident 30 years prior to the health of non-exposed workers. There are two experts on the subject. William Sanjour, who led the Toxic Waste Division of the Environmental Protection Agency, and Gerson Smoger, a lawyer who represents Vietnam veterans.
In 1990, Dr. Kate Jenkins, a colleague of mine at EPA, wrote a memorandum pointing out that allegations had been made that those studies, some of those studies that Monsanto had conducted were flawed. And if they were done correctly, would have reached just the opposite result of that Monsanto had. The Monsanto studies showed that dioxin was not a human carcinogen.
That means they had the data first, and then they manipulated how they were going to look at that data to come up with the conclusion they want. It's absolutely, you never do a study that way, never. And they did it absolutely wrong, and they achieved what they wanted. And it came out later that there were people that had cancer that in one of these two studies were listed as being exposed to dioxin, and the same 5 people in another study were listed as not being exposed. When you put all these cancers into the unexposed, then it looked like the unexposed people were getting as much cancer as the exposed, and they said, "But there's no difference. See, they're the same."
So then thousands of veterans were disallowed benefits because of exposure to Agent Orange.
So all policy was affected by those studies for 7 to 9 years in this country.
Being a good scientist and a good EPA employee, and someone, by the way, who was quite fearless, Kate Jenkins wrote a memorandum to the EPA Science Advisory Board asking them to review these 2 studies to see if they were correctly done. The fact is, there was no investigation of Monsanto. It didn't exist. Nobody investigated those studies. Nobody, period. What they investigated was Kate Jenkins, the whistleblower. They made her life a hell. They harassed her. They changed her jobs. They persecuted the poor woman.
If you think of Monsanto today, they are telling that their GMOs, for instance, are sound and safe. Do you trust
I wouldn't
the
believe
company?
a word that company says. Nothing. I might trust some independent source who investigated their claims, depending on who that independent source was and how good they are and how independent they are.
Precisely. In order to prove the safety of Roundup Ready soybeans, Monsanto carried out a study which was published in 1996 in a well-respected scientific journal. The study was supposed to assess the effects of GM soybeans on animal health, specifically on rats. This study was thoroughly reviewed by both a Danish scientist, now deceased, and the Norwegian specialist Ian Prime.
I'm afraid to say, value this study very poorly indeed. It's very disappointing, very disappointing. Especially because this paper sort of served as a basis for the whole principle of substantial equivalence. I can just cite, which is again a bit surprising, although the animal feeding studies provide some reassurance that no major changes occurred. Now, some reassurance, now that's not good enough. I want 100% reassurance, not just some reassurance. They talk, for example, about the, on page 723, except for the darker brown colour, livers appeared normal at necropsy. I mean, you can't do that without looking inside. You have to look at the content inside the liver, taking sections, showing under the microscope that there is no difference. They've used, for example, older rats. Obviously, again, if you want to avoid any problems, okay, use an adult. But if you want to see if any changes are evident, then you should use younger individuals, of course. In some ways, you can say it's bad science because a lot of the data that they should have shown isn't shown.
But did you try, for instance, to get access to the raw data?
I didn't. A colleague of mine did, and spent quite a frustrating length of time going through different offices and so on. But finally, the answer was the answer was no. If there was nothing to hide, then there should be no problem. You should be willing to distribute your material for anybody to work on. And when you keep it tight, then you suspect that there's why is this the case?
One thing is sure, thanks to this limited study, Monsanto's GMOs have inundated the world, principally in North and South America, Asia, and Australia. After only 10 years, transgenic crops now cover 250 million acres. 70% are Roundup resistant, and 30% have been genetically modified to produce an insecticide called Bt. Since 2001, the company has published a yearly document titled The Pledge Report, a kind of ethics statement in which Monsanto tries to justify its business practices. At the heart of the opposition to GMOs is the subject of patents. This is what Monsanto calls their intellectual property, which are supposed to protect their investment. In North America, every farmer who buys bioengineered seeds must sign a technology agreement in which the farmer promises to respect the company's patent on the modified gene. Cases of unintended appearance of our proprietary varieties on a farmer's field, we will surely work to resolve the matter to the satisfaction of both the farmer and Monsanto. The reality seems much less idyllic. The Center for Food Safety in Washington, D.C. published a study on farmers sued by Monsanto for having not respected its seed patents. It found at least 100 lawsuits and many bankruptcies. Among the victims, Troy Rush, an Indiana farmer.
Our story starts back in 1999. A gentleman, and I use that term loosely, showed up at my mother and father's farm, and he claimed to be a private investigator hired by Monsanto. And he was out investigating farmers saving their own seed, and asked us, he'd come right out and ask us if we'd saved their seed, and we told him no, we had not, and offered up our herbicide purchases and seed purchases, all the receipts and everything. Told him where everything was purchased so he could go check it out for himself. He declined that offer, and what occurred is then they sued us. Monsanto filed a lawsuit against myself, my father, and my two brothers. And Monsanto presented us with documents that they claimed were samples taken from our farms. To obtain those samples, Monsanto had to have trespassed upon our land without our permission and stole those samples. That year, I recall we had 492 acres of Roundup Ready soybeans, and they were grown under contract for a company for seed. And the contract was very specific. It spelled out the specific fields, so it wasn't a problem in isolating those fields. Everybody knew it.
And why did you settle out of court with Monsanto?
Well, after 2.5 years of this, the family was just destroyed. The stress involved in this, I mean, they're in essence threatening 5 generations of work. And if they would to prevail in something like this, it's all gone. They take it all away. They take it all away.
Good morning.
Morning, sir.
How are you this morning, Troy?
I'm well. How are you, David?
Still surviving?
Good.
Troy Roush and David Runyon grow conventional soybeans. They have been victims of the so-called gene police. Created by Monsanto to enforce its law in the fields, the gene police sow fear in rural America, where farmers denounce the totalitarian methods used in a GMO-dominated world.
I have some pictures here for you, Troy, I'd like you to look at.
Okay.
Here's what I have done, Troy, to help prevent re-entry on my farm of anyone coming onto my farm. summer. It was in July of 2003. And they came, it was the latter part of July, they came to my house. It was like 7 p.m.
Who came?
Monsanto employees. And they presented me a business card. And they asked me a few questions about the kind of soybeans I plant, the kind of corn I plant, where I market my crops. And so I said, okay, that's the end of the conversation.
Yeah, patents have changed. They've changed everything.
It revolves with a relationship of trust with neighbors. That is gone. Myself, I probably only have 2 farmers that I talk to that are close to me.
Are they really afraid, the farmers?
Of course they're afraid. You can't defend yourself against these people. They've created a little industry that serves no other purpose than to wreck farmers' lives. Of course they're afraid.
Does it mean that you're afraid, for instance, that a neighbor can snitch on you?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
Yes.
All you have to do is
dial 1-800.
Dial 1-800 Monsanto. Or no, I'm sorry, 1-800 Roundup. I remember encouraging farmers to call this toll-free number and turn their neighbor in.
And why does Monsanto do that?
Well, the reason they do it is control.
Seeds?
Yeah. They want to control the seed. They want to own life. I mean, this is the building blocks of food we're talking about. They are in the process of owning food. All food.
Between 1995 and 2005, Monsanto acquired over 50 seed companies throughout the world. These companies produce corn, cotton, wheat, and soybean, and also seeds for tomatoes, potatoes, and sorghum. Everywhere, people worry about Monsanto's monopoly, which in the long term threatens to wipe out all non-transgenic varieties. India is the world's 3rd largest cotton producer. In 1999, Monsanto acquired Mexico, the country's leading seed company. 2 years later, the Indian government authorized the sale of BT cotton under the brand name Balgard. It is genetically modified to produce an insecticide which repels bollworms, a cotton parasite.
చూసారా బోల్గార్డ్ శక్తి యొక్క వాగ్దానం స్ప్రే తక్కువ లాభం ఎక్కువ బోల్గార్డ్ ప్రతి విత్తనాలు కాయదులుచు పురుగులతో పోరాడే శక్తి.
Since 2001, Kiran Sakari and Abdul Gayam have been closely following the transgenic cotton grown by small farmers in the Warangal district. Every year, the 2 agronomists publish a report comparing bioengineered cotton with conventional cotton in terms of yields and production costs. In 2006, the harvest was ravaged by a disease that affects transgenic cotton.
This is a Bolgard field. We can see some of the rhizoctonia affected plants. You see, if you remove the bark of a healthy plant, it won't be like this, like threads. See, it's a classic example of rhizoctonia infestation.
The farmers, they have never seen that. And when we were doing our study from 2001, we have noted this disease on very few samples in the BT cotton only. And as the time passed, the spread was seen more and more in the BT fields as well as some non-BT fields also. But I personally feel that there may be some interaction, undesirable interaction between the host plant where the gene was introduced and the gene which is carrying the BT. And that has introduced the weakness in the plant to not to resist this rhizoctonia.
I have seen the website of the Monsanto. BT cotton reduces 78% of the pesticide reduction and pesticide consumption, and it gives to 30% better yields. But it's an utter flop. After 90 days, invariably you have to spray for bollworms, even on the BT cotton.
How do you explain that so many farmers are buying BT seeds?
See, presently the option is is getting narrower and narrower to the farmer. During the current season, even farmer wanted to go for non-BT. There was no non-BT hybrid seed available in the market.
Today in India, Monsanto controls nearly all of the cottonseed market. forcing the locals to buy its seeds at prices 4 times higher than conventional varieties. Small farmers must turn to moneylenders who charge high interest rates. If the harvest is poor, it means bankruptcy, a vicious circle which is decimating Indian villages.
आज जी आपल्या इथं आत्महत्या झाली ती कशामुळे झाली?
बीटी कॉटन
अजून काय कारण होतं?
कर्जबाजारी.
वय काय होतं?
25.
हा, ही कन्झ्युम्ड पेस्टिसाइड 1 लिटर पेस्टिसाइड. पहिलं सुसाईड आहे का?
जगात किती झाली?
Tragedies like the one we've just witnessed occur 3 times a day in the Vidarbha region, where BT cotton was introduced in 2005. Of course, cotton farmers committing suicide is not new in India, but the GM crops are causing it to skyrocket. However, in this battle that pits David against Goliath, few dare to publicly denounce this international scandal.
This is Vidarbha's rice growing belt. So if you see, the minimum suicides are there. But this is the cotton growing area. The result of the BT cotton is the first year 600 suicides from June 2005 to June 2006. Second year, still today, within 6 months, 680 suicides. So it's a disaster.
It's a complete disaster, yes. All these technologies, either it is GM or biotechnology, they are actually making the farmers completely dependent on the market. Because not only that you have to pay more for the seed procurement, but you have to fertilize it. And this very claim that no spraying is required, no pesticide required, is also false.
When Monsanto claims in advertising that GM crops are adapted for small farmers, what do you think it's?
Our experience shows that it is completely false. It's completely false. It's a lie.
Seeds of Suicide is the title of a book by physicist Vandana Shiva. She won the Alternative Nobel Prize and heads the Navdana organization, which aims to conserve traditional seeds. In the beginning, Vandana Shiva's battle was against the first Green Revolution, which brought industrial agriculture to India in the 1960s. Today, she denounces what she calls the second Green Revolution, that of GMOs protected by patents.
The difference is that the first Green Revolution was public sector driven. It was driven by government agencies. The government agencies control the research. In the case of the second Green Revolution, it is driven by Monsanto. It is a Monsanto-driven revolution. The second big difference is that the first Green Revolution did have a hidden objective of selling more chemicals. But its first objective was providing food. It was food security. And yes, they grew less pulses, they grew less oilseeds, but they did grow more rice and wheat. It fed people. The second Green Revolution has nothing to do with food security. It's not about food security. It is about returns to Monsanto's profits. That's all it is about. They've always said genetic engineering is the way to get to patenting, but patenting is the real aim. If you look at Monsanto's research agenda, they are testing at this point something like 20 crops with BT genes in them. There's nothing they're leaving untouched. The mustard, the okra, the brinjal, the rice, the cauliflower. Once they have established the norm that seed can be owned as their property, royalties can be collected, we will depend on them for every seed we grow, of every crop we grow. If they control seed, they control food. They know it. It's strategic. It's more powerful than bombs. It's more powerful than guns. This is the best way to control the populations of the world.
Mexico is the center of origin for corn. More than 150 local corn varieties can be found in just the southern region of Oaxaca. This extensive biodiversity is a treasure, the world's genetic reservoir of corn. Millions of Mexican farmers have maintained it for thousands of years.
This corn is for the family?
Yes, only for the family. We use it to make tortillas. This year is a good size, so we'll save it as seed for next year's planting.
You don't buy your seeds?
No.
You exchange them?
Yes, it's our ancient barter system.
To preserve its corn's diversity, Mexico has banned genetically modified crops. However, due to the NAFTA free trade agreement it signed with the United States and Canada, Mexico cannot stop the massive importation of American corn, 40% of which is genetically modified. This industrial corn, as it's called in Mexico, is highly subsidized by the U.S. government. So on local markets, it costs half as much as traditional Mexican corn.
Do you always make your tortillas with local corn?
Yes.
It's natural and has a better yield. Also, it's more nourishing because it comes from pure soil. That's blue corn. In the past, my ancestors only planted this kind of corn. Today, we maintain it as well.
It existed before the Spanish conquest?
Yes. There's another kind of conquest.
What's the new conquest?
It's the transgenic conquest that wants to destroy everything by making local corn disappear so that their industrial corn can dominate. If they succeed, we'll be dependent on multinationals. We'll be forced to buy the fertilizer and insecticides they sell, because without them, their corn won't grow. Whereas the local corn grows very well without fertilizer or herbicide. Look at it. It's very beautiful.
In Paraguay, 70% of the farmland is owned by only 2% of the population. With GMOs, the concentration is increasing. 3/4 of the soybean producers are foreigners staking claims for this new green gold. The ban on animal-based feed after the mad cow epidemic and the recent biofuel craze have caused soy prices to soar, triggering a rush to Roundup-ready crops. According to the last census in Paraguay, each year 100,000 people leave rural areas to live in urban slums. An estimated 70% flee Monsanto's genetically modified soybeans, which are destined to feed Europe's chickens, cows, and pigs.
We are going to talk about the production model of GM soybeans promoted by Monsanto. It's a true multinational company. It's everywhere in the world. Its objective is to control all of the world's food production through farmerless farming. The result is that Monsanto is depriving us of our food sovereignty, of our ability to feed ourselves without depending on anyone else. That is why we say that we must fight for our independence, for our land. We must defend our communities, our families, and our country.
In my case, my family lives in the city, but I don't want to go there. In the city, you have to buy everything, even food. Here, whatever we grow is ours. We can eat whatever we want, but in the city, you can't. If you don't have money, you have to search for food in garbage cans.
Then, incredibly, at 5 p.m, something began to happen. Later I managed to get a copy of the guest list, the names of the men who really did roll past us up the drive of the Caesar Park. There was Umberto Agnelli, chairman of Fiat. There was Paul Allaire, chairman of Xerox. There was Conrad Black, chairman of the Daily Telegraph. There was Kenneth Clark. There was Donald Graham, publisher of the Washington Post. There was Richard Holbrooke, ambassador to the United Nations. There was Henry Kissinger. There was Peter Mandelson. There was William McDonough, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. There were CEOs of Nokia and SmithKline Beecham. There was David Rockefeller, chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank. There was Robert Shapiro, CEO of Monsanto. And there was James Wolfenson, president of the World Bank.
Something happened in 1940 which marked the beginning of a new era, the era of the ability to synthesize and create on an unlimited scale new chemicals that had never existed before in the world.
And using the magic of research, oil companies compete with each other in taking the petroleum molecule apart and rearranging it into, well, you name it.
So suddenly it became possible to produce any new chemicals, synthetic chemicals, the likes of which had never existed before in the world, for any purpose and at virtually no cost.
Fabrics, toothbrushes, tires, insecticides, cosmetics, weed killers, a whole galaxy of things to make a better life on Earth.
For instance, if you wanted to go to a chemist and say, look, I want to have a chemical, say a pesticide, which will persist throughout the food chain, and I don't want it to have to renew it very, very often. I'd like it to be relatively non-destructible. And then he'd put two benzene molecules on the blackboard and add a chlorine here and a chlorine that, and that was DDT.
When the 8th Army needed Jap civilians to help them out in our occupation, they called on native doctors to administer DDT under the supervision of our men to stem a potential typhus epidemic. Dusting like this goes a long way in checking disease, and the laughs are them. Pardon our dust.
As the petrochemical era grew and grew, warning signs emerged that some of these chemicals could pose hazards. The data initially were trivial, anecdotal, but gradually a body of data started accumulating to the extent that we now know that the synthetic chemicals which have permeated our workplace, our consumer products, our air, our water, produce cancer and also birth defects and some other toxic effects. Furthermore, industry has known about this, at least most industries have known about this, and have attempted to trivialize these risks. If I take a gun and shoot you, That's criminal. If I expose you to some chemicals which knowingly are going to kill you, what difference is there? The difference is that it takes longer to kill you. We are now in the midst of a major cancer epidemic, and I have no doubt, and I have documented the basis for this, that industry is largely responsible for this overwhelming epidemic of cancer, in which 1 in every 2 men get cancer in their lifetimes, and 1 in every 3 women get cancer in their lifetimes. Towards the end of 1989, a great box of documents arrived at my office without any indication where they came from. And I opened them and found in it a complete set of Monsanto files, particularly a set of files dealing with toxicological testing of cows who'd been given RBGH.
BST, trade name Posilac, is being used in more than a quarter of the dairy herds in the United States, according to Monsanto. The milk has been drunk by a large portion of the American population since the Food and Drug Administration declared it safe for both cows and humans 4 years ago.
And at that time, Monsanto was saying, there's no evidence whatsoever of any adverse effects, we don't use antibiotics, and this clearly showed that they had lied through their teeth. The files described areas of chronic inflammation in the heart, lung, kidney, spleen, also reproductive effects, also a whole series of other problems.
The most comprehensive independent assessment of the drug concludes that BST results in unnecessary pain, suffering, and distress for the cows. This is not acceptable for a drug designed simply to increase milk production.
It is a silly product. The industrial world is awash in milk. We're overproducing milk. We actually have governments around the world who pay farmers not to produce milk. So the first product Monsanto comes up with is a product that produces more of what we don't need.
Of course, you'll want to inject Posilac to every eligible cow, as each cow not treated is a lost income opportunity.
But the problem was that use of the artificial hormone caused all kinds of problems for the cows. It caused something called mastitis, which is a very painful infection of the udders. When you milk the cow, if the cow has bad mastitis, some of the, and I don't know how to say this in a, I hope people aren't watching at dinner time, but the pus from the infection of the udders ends up in the milk, and the somatic cell count, they call it, the bacteria count inside your milk goes up.
There's a cost to the cows. The cows get sicker when they're injected with RBGH. They're injected with antibiotics. We know that people are consuming antibiotics through their food, and we know that that's contributing to antibiotic-resistant bacteria and diseases. And we know we're at a crisis when somebody can go into a hospital and get a staph infection and it can't be cured and they die. That's a crisis.
Bad for the cow, bad for the farmer, bad potentially for the consumer. The jury is out. We see a lot of conflicting evidence about potential health risks. And of course, as a consumer, my belief is, why should I take any risk?
Factory farm cows have not been the only victims of Monsanto products. Large areas of Vietnam were deforested by the U.S. military using Monsanto's Agent Orange. The toxic herbicide reportedly caused over 50,000 birth defects, as well as hundreds of thousands of cancers in Vietnamese civilians and soldiers, and in former American troops serving in Southeast Asia. Unlike the Vietnamese victims, U.S. Vietnam veterans exposed to Agent Orange were able to sue Monsanto for causing their illnesses. Monsanto settled out of court, paying $80 million in damages, but it never admitted guilt.
Over 12,000 years ago, people began planting and saving seed. Agriculture flowered, and civilizations were born. In China, thousands of varieties of rice were grown. Over 5,000 kinds of potatoes were cultivated worldwide. In the US alone, more than 7,000 varieties of apples were grown in the 19th century. In the 20th century, the face of farming underwent a radical change. The manufacture of nitrogen-based bombs during World War I led to the development of nitrogen-based chemical fertilizers. Nerve gas, developed during World War II, was slightly modified to make insecticides. DDT was the hero of its generation. New technologies promised higher yields, increased food production, cheaper prices, and greater availability. By the mid-20th century, these technologies, along with new developments in plant breeding, led to the Green Revolution.
I think the people who first imagined the Green Revolution had good hearts. Lots of people are starving around the planet. That's long been the case in human civilization. Their thinking was if we could just systematize agriculture like we did industry in the 1800s and bring it worldwide, bring one system that works, we can solve the problems that people have long had with agriculture.
The next several decades saw a remarkable increase in production. Year after year, huge fields were planted with only one variety of crop. These monocultures created an ecological vacuum that insects and disease could exploit. This uniformity has led to some of the greatest agricultural catastrophes of mankind. In the mid-1800s, very few varieties of potatoes were cultivated in Ireland. When they became diseased, 1 million people died. When the same potato blight attacked Peru, they suffered fewer consequences. Today, only 4 varieties of potatoes are widely grown. 97% of the varieties of vegetables grown at the beginning of the 20th century are now extinct. Genetic uniformity leads to an increased vulnerability to insects and disease. Farmers found themselves trapped on a pesticide treadmill. The more they sprayed, the more they had to spray. The increased use of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides increased costs, polluted water, and created health risks. Then in the 1970s, Monsanto introduced Roundup. Because of its ability to kill most weeds, it became one of the most popular herbicides in history. In the mid-1990s, building on technologies that used gene splicing, the Green Revolution turned into the Gene Revolution. Capitalizing on the new technology, Monsanto genetically modified its seeds to be Roundup ready. Normally, Roundup kills anything green, but if the plant is Roundup ready, when it is sprayed, it doesn't die. Now the company that sells you the herbicide also sells you the seed. With Monsanto's BT corn, the corn itself is registered as an insecticide. This is because every cell has been engineered to manufacture BT, a natural bacterial toxin. If a corn borer eats any part of the plant, it will die. One of the most controversial aspects of the gene revolution is the patenting of seeds.
There was a very good reason why for virtually 200 years the Patent Office and Congress did not allow for the patenting of life.
The right to patent is guaranteed by Article 1 in the Constitution. Food crops were deliberately excluded from patenting on moral grounds. Starting in the 1930s, plant breeders were given the right to patent their work. But the patent protection did not extend to the subsequent generations of seeds.
You know, clearly when you patent a tennis racket, let's say, with a new sweet spot, you can describe that very accurately to the patent office. But how in the world can you describe a whole plant, much less generations down when that's changed and mutated?
But in 1978, Dr. Ananda Chakrabarty took the first living organism to the patent office.
Chakrabarty was an engineer for General Electric, and he created an oil-eating microbe and tried to get it patented. And the U.S. Patent Office said, no way, we do not allow you to patent parts of nature. You know, if you have a tennis racket or a toaster, you can patent that, but you can't patent a part of nature. But General Electric and Chakrabarty were very insistent. They took it all the way to the Supreme Court. In a one-vote majority decision, they said, you can patent this genetically engineered microbe. Interestingly enough, this oil-eating microbe was never used because even though it did eat oil and oil spills, it apparently ate a lot of other things for dessert.
The floodgates were now open for genetic engineering.
During the Reagan administration, they said, let's patent animals. And then human genes and human body parts. I think what the companies would like to say is, we are patenting the gene. And wherever that gene goes, we own anything that we put it in. If it goes into a plant, we own the plant. If it goes into an animal, we own the animal. They might even say around the world, if it goes into a human being, we own that human being. There would be some constitutional problems with that in the United States. But they clearly would want their patent to follow the gene.
The issue of patenting life has never been voted on by the people or the Congress of the United States.
It actually means giving corporations, incredibly, the power to own, control the species of the earth.
While corporations were patenting everything under the sun, they were also busy in another area.
Starting in about 1995, the stock market was running up, and Monsanto was buying up seed companies, and DuPont was buying Pioneer, and there was this, basically, the U.S. pesticide industry bought the seed industry for all intents and purposes.
Monsanto spends $8 billion buying up seed companies. By the 1990s, corporations begin patenting not only GMO seeds, but seeds that haven't been genetically engineered. The only requirement is that they have not been patented before.
It's one of the wonderful things about what our government has done for the years with seeds is trying to save seeds so that we can preserve biodiversity. What companies have done is gone into those seed banks, find the seeds that aren't patented, and patent them. And as long as they're the first person at the patent office, they get the patent.
It is estimated that Monsanto owns 11,000 patents.
Why would corporations do this? Because then they can take the one seed they want to use to replace all these seeds, and it will own the marketplace.
I've been farming for 53 years, and in those years I've grown mostly wheat, canola, oats, and peas. This field has had wheat, and the field behind me has canola in it, or rapeseed as it is known in Europe. When our grandparents came to this country, there was no such thing as chemical companies or seed companies, and they had to rely and develop their own seed, borrow seed from their neighbors, or bring it from Europe with them.
Percy was known in this part of Canada as a seed developer and a seed saver.
I would say that our best grains, our best seeds, have not been developed by research people or scientists. They have been developed by farmers.
In 1997, Percy sprayed Monsanto's Roundup around the power poles and ditches as he had done for years. Some canola plants did not die.
I thought initially that some of those plants didn't die because I had been spraying year after year after year with Roundup in the same area, and companies warn you, you shouldn't spray every year because you could develop a resistance. Monsanto found out about it, and they went on my land that I farm without my knowledge, without my permission, and took plants or seeds and said some of that was Monsanto's Roundup Ready canola. In August the 6th of 1998, they launched a lawsuit against me.
Monsanto claimed that Percy had illegally obtained their genetically modified canola without a license and had infringed on their patent.
Patents historically have been for things like, I've used the example of a carburetor. Well, a carburetor doesn't get up one day and start replicating itself everywhere and introducing itself into your car so that all of a sudden you have somebody else's carburetor one morning and then you get sued for patent infringement. So that's the unique nature of this type of technology, that once you've unleashed it into the environment, uncontrolled and unconfined, it will spread everywhere.
Before the main trial, Monsanto withdrew then all their allegations against me that I had ever obtained a seed illegally. And they went on to say that it didn't matter how the seed got on to my land, I still infringed on their patent.
Because my land is on the east side of the road, the main road, the prevailing winds here are from the west. So it would be natural for the canola that blew off of trucks to land in the field here. In fact, one farmer told me that when he drove past my land hauling a Roundup Ready canola, his tarp had broken, and he estimated he lost enough past my 2 miles of land to seed 2,000 acres.
Well, I think one of the biggest issues in the case is where to draw the line between the people and the companies who produce and come up with this new technology. The line ended up being drawn way into the farmers' fields. And our contention was the line should clearly be drawn such that farmers have a right to continue to farm. They should be able to save and reuse their own seed. They should be able to buy seed, conventional seed, from their neighbors as they've had in the past, without having to worry about whether they're infringing somebody's patent now.
1999, when I went to seed my canola fields, I was advised by my lawyer not to use my own seed again because I now knew it was contaminated by Monsanto's genetic altered canola. And it was seed that was adapted to this region and grew quite well because it was resistant to various diseases.
Percy destroyed over 1,000 pounds of seed that he and his wife had developed over decades.
The lawsuit and my loss of my seeds was the hardest thing that could have ever happened to us.
Now here Monsanto comes along, what we worked for all these years, they just want to take it away just like that from us. I could never do that to go into their office and take anything. I would be prosecuted. And they can just come and do anything to the farmers just like they own them or so. It really is upsetting. And I feel they're taking my rights away and our privacy. And we're not the only ones they've been doing too, as many others. Why are they prosecuting so many of these little farmers? Well, they're only maybe worth a couple of 100,000 when they're such a multinational company. Why? Is it greed, or is it they just want to control all the seeds?
Percy was not the only farmer accused by Monsanto.
In the summer of 2000, my family and I were discussing how rude we thought it was that Monsanto never sent us a letter or thanked us for cooperating with their investigation into our business. We were stunned when in late July of the year 2000, we received a letter from a law firm in New Orleans that was representing Monsanto Company, accusing us of infringing on their patent. Every accused grower in the United States that I've talked to had nearly identical stories. They come and test your crop. The farmers that have nothing to hide figure, well, they'll find that we didn't plant this crop that they say, and they come back over a year later and accuse you of this when the farmer can't go back and take crop samples and disprove them. Monsanto had told us that they had sampled all 3,850 acres of our soybean crop. The samplers would have had to have been gathering one sample continuously every 20 seconds. after examining the testimony that we gave, realized their story didn't add up. Now they changed their story, saying they only took a handful of samples per field. Are we to assume that they were lying in their first attempt to extort money from us, or are they lying now?
Estimates are that Monsanto has sent out 9,000 letters to farmers. Most farmers choose to pay to avoid lawsuits. Even so, there are 100 active lawsuits in the United States alone. When the farmers do settle with Monsanto, they have to agree to never discuss their settlement.
We feel that we were profiled by Monsanto because of the size of our farm, and that they wanted to try to make an example out of us to scare other farmers into never saving their own seed, to be too scared to save their own seed.
Eventually, my case went to court after 2.5 years, and Monsanto dragged me through those courts in pre-trial. They did everything to break me and basically took all of our retirement funds, because just my lawyer fees alone up to date have been around $200,000.
One of the sons said, "Mom and Dad, I hope it won't get you down because they're trying to destroy you, but I hope you're strong and you just get through it all." He says, that's the only way changes will be made in our country with these big companies.
Monsanto ready to wage war. Schmeizer's case opened the door for Monsanto to pursue other patent breaches. A lot of people have asked me why I didn't just settle. I probably could have settled for maybe a slap on the wrist or maybe a few $1,000s fine. But what I did was talk it over with my wife and said, look, they destroyed our seed, everything we've worked for in the last 50 years. And if I sign this, that I grew genetic altered canola without a license when we were doing our own thing, minding our own business, I couldn't live with myself. And I feel that it was taking my fundamental rights away from me. My grandparents left a system like that way back, turn of the century, to get away from control and a feudal type system. Are we going to want to go back to that? And we said no. We'll fight it and stand up for what we believe in.
And what did the judge rule after 2.5 weeks of trial? He said it didn't matter how Monsanto's genetic altered canola got into my field. And then he went on and specified. He said whether it cross-pollinated or if it blew in by the wind, by birds, bees, animals, or falling off a farmer's truck, a combine, and so on, it didn't matter. The fact that there was some plants there, I violated Monsanto's patent, even though I didn't want it in my field. Number 2, which is the most important one, I think, he ruled any farmer that has a regular conventional plant, it doesn't matter what kind of plant, if it's a tree, if it's a seed, and it gets cross-pollinated with Monsanto's gene against your wishes and destroys your property, my plant becomes Monsanto's property. Now stop and think what that means to farmers all over the world, farmers, gardeners, anything to do with a life-giving form. The third issue he ruled, the fact that I never used Monsanto's patent, which means I never used Monsanto's Roundup Ready herbicide or glyphosate on my crop, he ruled that's immaterial. He said the fact was that there were some plants there. So that shows you the power of patent law over farmers' rights.
Using biotechnology to produce food is not new. For nearly 6,000 years, people have used yeast, a living organism, to make bread rise. And we've used biotech for almost as long to ferment beer and wine.
So there's really nothing new here. But that is completely wrong. Genetic engineering is really a radical revolution in food production. It's really a cell invasion technology. You know, people have heard they're taking a flounder gene and putting it in tomato so the tomato can last in cold temperatures. But people don't ask, how does that flounder gene get in that tomato? How does it get in there? And what really happens is, the only way you can do it is to invade the cell of the tomato and deposit the flounder gene. Well, what's good at invading cells? Bacteria and viruses.
After 12 years of searching, Monsanto found a soil bacteria that is naturally immune to Roundup herbicide. Their goal was to generate DNA from these bacteria into various plants. They cut out a sequence of DNA that is resistant to Roundup. But if this DNA sequence alone is inserted into a corn plant, it will have no effect. So the next step involves E. coli bacteria. Gaps are created in the E. coli DNA, and when the two test tubes are mixed together, some of the E. coli DNA recombines with the Roundup-resistant bacteria. Then the technicians smuggle the engineered DNA into the cells of the corn plant they want to modify. Cells will naturally reject foreign DNA, so they developed a method using soil bacteria that causes tumors in plants. They use this bacteria to ferry the engineered DNA into the plant's nucleus. There are also two other methods used to get the engineered DNA through the cell wall. One uses a stream of electricity to create tiny holes in the plant cells so they become vulnerable to infiltration by foreign DNA. Another is the gene gun, which blasts particles of gold coated with engineered DNA into the plant cells. Each of these three methods needs a promoter gene that turns on the desired characteristics. The promoter gene is often extracted from the cauliflower mosaic virus.
This capacity of bacteria and viruses to invade mammals in different ways is what really has a lot of people edgy about biotechnology, because that's really what the tools are all about. In order to move genetic material from one organism to another that don't normally cross, you've got to sort of behave like bacteria and viruses and invade into the cells and become established, just like a virus must become established.
And they do one more thing. They attach to that an antibiotic marker system.
The antibiotic marker is a gene which is naturally resistant to a specific antibiotic, so later they can test whether the genetic cassette is being expressed.
The most cataclysmic force in the food system right now is the fact that the medical community is just terrified about the loss of antibiotics. No one really understands how using antibiotic marker genes in genetic engineering techniques might contribute to the problem. The biomedical community on a worldwide basis is absolutely focused on this problem now.
As we move on into this so-called biotech revolution and we start producing more and more transgenic manipulations, we'll start seeing pieces of DNA interacting with each other in ways that are totally unpredictable.
We have now learned that genes function in complex networks, and a single gene can express or influence many traits.
I think this is probably the largest biological experiment humanity has ever entered into.
The Flavor Saver tomato was the first genetically engineered food to reach the public. Calgene, the corporation that produced the tomato, had done 3 voluntary feeding studies on rats and found lesions in some of the rats' stomachs. Over the objections of several government scientists, the tomatoes were approved in May 1994. The Flavor Saver tomato didn't hold up in shipping, and consumers didn't like it, so it was taken off the market. The first time many Americans became aware that genetically modified foods were part of their everyday diet was in the year 2001.
Last fall, during lunch with co-workers, Grace Booth enjoyed 3 chicken enchiladas. The food, she recalls, was very good, but then something went very wrong.
I felt my chest getting tight, and it was hard to breathe.
She didn't know, but she was going into shock.
What are you thinking at this point?
I thought, oh my God, what is happening to me? What is going on? Something is very, very wrong. I felt like I was gonna die.
In the emergency room in nearby Oakland, the diagnosis was severe allergic reaction. And from here, Grace Booth's story reached official Washington. At the time, the national corn market was in an uproar. Starling, a gene-modified corn not approved for human food, had been found in taco shells, and recalls were emptying the shelves of corn products. The fear was possible allergic reactions.
If I want a bowl of cornflakes, I want to know that it's safe to eat a bowl of cornflakes.
Do you feel that level of safety right now?
Absolutely not.
It is almost inevitable that there have been thousands of people that have had from a very mild to perhaps serious allergic reaction to Starling, you know.
If it had not been for public interest organizations going in and testing that corn on our own, doing the government's job for it, this scandal would never have come out, and this potential health risk to humans never would have been discovered.
There are 3 government agencies which are responsible for the safety of GMOs. The Department of Agriculture is responsible for assessing the environmental impacts of GMO crops and regulates GMO field testing. But a study of over 8,000 GMO field test applications showed that the USDA did not require a single environmental assessment. The Environmental Protection Agency regulates insecticides. BT, a natural insecticide, is engineered into every cell of genetically engineered BT crops. The Food and Drug Administration is responsible for food safety. Any novel substance in food must be tested.
When the biotech companies went to get regulatory approval, they did so on the basis that what they were doing was substantially equivalent, was the term which was being used, substantially equivalent to classical breeding practices, and therefore it should not be regulated in any way. At the same time, however, companies have insisted on patenting their products, and in order to get a patent, it has to be different than anything else. So on the one hand, we're saying it's very different because we don't want to patent it. On the other hand, it's substantially equivalent, so don't bug us with regulation.
Substantial equivalency is obviously nonsense. These, at the cellular level, again, these foods have bacteria, viruses, new genetic constructs that no other foods ever had in history. They're clearly not equivalent.
Since GMOs were considered substantially equivalent to regular food, they fall into the GRAS, or Generally Recognized as Safe category, and the government does not require testing or labeling.
To me, one of the most incomprehensible things about U.S. policy is that we do not even require the labeling of genetically engineered foods.
Many of those GMOs are in the form of corn syrup and soy lecithin. In 2002, a concerned mother in Oregon put a couple $1,000s into an initiative to label GMOs.
How can we trust the same multinational corporations that told us that PCBs, DDT, and dioxin are safe? They don't even want us to know what it is that we're eating. The FDA ignored their own scientists' warnings about the dangers of genetically engineered foods. This is our children's future we're talking about. Let's join 25 other countries that require labeling. It doesn't cost their farmers or consumers anymore. Vote yes on 27. Let's label genetically engineered foods.
The measure was defeated by the $4.6 million industry campaign that features a farmer who resembles the mother.
The last thing we need is more government red tape, more bureaucracy, and higher costs. But that's exactly what Oregon farmers, consumers, and taxpayers would get if Measure 27 passes.
Poll after poll has revealed that 80 to 90% of Americans want GMO food labeled. But the Genetically Engineered Food Right to Know Act that Representative Kucinich, Senator Boxer, and others have introduced every year since 1999 is still waiting to be voted on by Congress.
The public in Europe has reacted with anger and concern at the idea that genetically engineered food products will be on their supermarket shelves. The latest polls showed at least 75% of the European public do not want genetically engineered food.
In response to demand from their citizens, all 15 countries of the European Union adopted rules requiring the labeling of genetically engineered food.
But I think there's a very good reason why the corporations have fought so hard against this labeling. It isn't just about consumer choice. Without labeling, there's no real traceability for the health effects of genetically engineered foods. If you're a mother and you're feeding your baby infant formula, and it's not labeled that it's genetically engineered with soy, for example, and your child has a toxic or allergic reaction, there's no way you're going to know that that was caused by genetic engineering because it's not on the label. If, however, it is on the label, then you can say, you know what, maybe that contributed to this response in my child. You go to your doctor records it, and there's traceability, and we can begin to get a database on the health effects. And of course, once that database is created, then we have liability to the corporations. So they're opposing labeling, not just because it creates choice and they're afraid that their products will not be bought, but also because labeling is the key way we can trace the health effects of genetically engineered foods and the key way to get the corporations liable for these health effects.
The Japanese people are deeply concerned about the effects of genetically modified food. A trade representative stated, "We will watch the children in the United States for the next 10 years." In addition to claiming these products were safe, the biotech industry claimed they would increase yield.
Advances in biotechnology can help us produce more food on land we already cultivate or on land that's currently unsuitable for farming.
Monsanto submitted a regulatory package to both the FDA and the EPA for Roundup Ready soybeans, the first really big commercial crop. It's really very curious, how shallow actually the science was. They didn't look at routine stresses, drought, plant pathogens, other things that, soybean plants deal with in the environment. In the year 2000, a team of scientists based at the University of Arkansas documented decreases in the size of the root system, and under droughty conditions, these reductions were 25%. Now that 25% impairment is going to translate into several bushels of lost yield in any part of the world. It's a very big impact. The other gap in the regulatory reviews was that no one bothered to explore the impact of the spraying of Roundup over the top of soybean plants on the capacity of the soybean plant to affix nitrogen. And it's one of the most important environmental benefits of soybeans. It's a legume, like peas, so you don't have to put nitrogen fertilizer in your garden when you're growing peas or soybeans. And we're only now starting to study this because farmers have observed problems in some fields with Roundup Ready soybeans. I mean, they just did terrible and couldn't explain why.
One of the biggest threats to yield comes from superweeds, weeds that have become resistant to herbicides like Roundup. In 2003, mare's tail, a superweed, spread into 21 states. Now farmers have to use dangerous chemicals such as 2,4-D, which is similar to Agent Orange and has been proven to cause birth defects. Instead of spraying less, they are spraying more. But how did this controversial new technology get approved by the government in the first place?
At the end of the first Bush administration, George Bush's administration, Dan Quayle ran something called the Competitiveness Council.
We will ensure that biotech products will receive the same oversight as other products, instead of being hampered by unnecessary regulation.
What Quayle's council recommended is that there be no regulation, at all for these foods. This outraged FDA scientists. There is voluminous documentation showing that FDA scientists said this food needs to be tested. This food can be toxic. This food can create new allergens. The genetic engineering process, the cell invasion technique that is genetic engineering, can lower nutrition. It can create immune problems in laboratory animals. All these things need to be tested, much less the environmental effects. But Dan Quayle and his council said, no way. We want to be the first in the world to market this food. FDA still said no. So what do? They brought in a deputy commissioner for food policy, a man named Michael Taylor. And Michael Taylor used to work at King & Spalding as Monsanto's senior counsel there. He had written up the industry regulations, which were basically no regulations, and of course, he allowed this no regulation policy to become official U.S. policy in 1992.
Monsanto employees and government regulatory agency employees are the same people. And to give you one example, there's countless names on this list, but one that kind of stands out to me, the biggest, is Linda Fisher. Linda Fisher, for the past 7 years, has been an executive vice president for Monsanto Corporation. She is now the deputy administrator for the EPA. Also as a deputy administrator under George Bush Sr.'s administration. Prior to that, she was with Monsanto. And prior to that, she was with the EPA. She's been back and forth 3 times. And the list goes on and on like that in Washington. I have written a letter to our Attorney General, John Ashcroft, and I begged him for help with this monumental crisis that farmers are facing and we're facing. His response was that it is not their policy to get involved in private litigation matters. I have since learned that Mr. John Ashcroft has submitted a brief to the U.S. Supreme Court regarding a similar patent infringement case to be heard in October. He preyed upon the Supreme Court to uphold these new plant patents to protect the corporations that own the patents. Upon learning this, I also learned that Mr. Ashcroft had received the largest campaign contribution that Monsanto gave any 2000 political candidate in his failed bid for Senate re-election.
By the year 2003, the U.S. had sold millions of pounds of GMO corn to Mexico for less than the cost of growing it. Around the world, resistance was mounting against the U.S. exported genetically modified crops. The loss of corn exports to Europe is worth around $300 million a year. This has only compounded the farm crisis in North America.
On the one side of the farmer, there's the oil and natural gas companies and fertilizer companies, seed and chemical and machinery companies and banks. And then the farmer is literally in the middle of an agri-food chain. Downstream, there's processors, railways, grain companies, restaurants, packers, etc. And what's happened in that chain is each link, with the exception of the farm link, is being dominated by fewer and fewer, larger and larger corporations. Those huge corporations that face little competition are able to extract extremely large revenues and profits out of that chain and leave very little for the family farmers. And what the family farmers do get is quickly snatched away by chemical and seed and fertilizer companies who themselves have tremendous market power.
My family has been enduring a living hell since this began. I am sure this is what led to my father's recent heart attack. He has been physically and emotionally shattered since this began. It has been heart-wrenching to watch our reputations be destroyed in our own community over something we did not do. I believe that the patenting of crops that extend to the progeny, in other words, the seed that a crop produces, like soybeans here, which cannot be kept controlled or kept separated on our farms, is nothing short of insane. What Monsanto told our legislature here in North Dakota was that if they attempted to put a moratorium on the introduction of this wheat, that one, they would pull all of their research dollars out of our state and our universities, which I quite frankly was very happy to hear, and two, they would file a lawsuit against the state of North Dakota for anti-commerce. This was the way that they tried to sell us, the state, a new product.
In the past, there were public institutions that supplied the farmers objective analysis of new technologies.
Universities started playing an important role in asking questions about this back then in the 70s, but soon enough it was evident that we did not want to have universities asking questions. So there was a big influx of money from industry to support research at universities, and that led to research that was favorable to the development of the industry and publicity that was simply promotional of the technologies.
The reality is that in our land-grant university system, and certainly in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, there's a small tolerance for people doing research that directly challenges the conventional wisdom.
It's ridiculous. You know, the recent work that we've done on the movement of transgenes in corn in the Centers of Diversification was run on $2,000. Compare that to $25 million coming the other way in exactly my college. And that is the only piece of work that I know is actually happening.
They allowed the patenting of one of the genes responsible for breast cancer. And many researchers who'd been working on a cure for breast cancer were no longer allowed to use that gene in their research because another company had patented it and charged them very, very high fees. Some of the major pharmaceutical companies have gone into university laboratories and sued those laboratories and sued researchers who are using the genes that they own. This is probably the largest private takings of what should be the commons that we all own in common that you could possibly imagine. And I think one of the most disturbing economic trends of our times.
While biotech companies take over on an intellectual level, and genetic engineering takes over on a cellular level, multinational corporations are taking over worldwide by consolidating our food supply.
A combination of Kraft and Nabisco creates a real global leader in the food industry. Scale is a real advantage in this industry. As Kraft has proven, it increases both efficiency and effectiveness
The average citizen doesn't really understand both the momentum and the extent to which consolidation is taking place in our whole food and agriculture system. Just to give you a couple of examples, 80% of our beef products now are being processed by just 4 companies. In seed companies, the vast majority of the seed that farmers plant now comes from just 4 clusters of companies. And what's even more worrisome now is in the last decade, that same kind of concentration has been taking place in the retail sector. And Heffernan now projects that in the next 10 years, all of the food in the retail level in the world will be controlled by 6 retail firms, only one of which will be American, and that's Walmart. Now that means that increasingly we're not going to have any choice about what's on the shelves in our supermarkets. What's going to be there is what some broker in a consolidated firm decides is going to return the largest profit.
With world population expected to increase by 2 billion people in the next 30 years, biotechnology could provide an important way to produce enough food.
One major problem with that, the reason why about 800 million people starve every day, and that is a tragic fact, has nothing to do with the amount of food available. Most of these people around the world who are starving used to be farmers, but because of the World Bank and the National Monetary Fund giving huge loans to these countries could no longer allow for subsistence farming. They had to grow expensive export crops back to the first world to pay back those loans. So they kicked all these hundreds of millions of farmers off their farms. They end up in the Bhopals and the Mexico cities and the Brasilias of the world without money. They no longer are growing their own food, and they're competing for the scarce jobs available in the new industrialization of these countries. They are no longer food independent. They're food dependent.
Amartya Sen, a Pulitzer Prize-winning economist, after a decade of work, pointed out again and again that the problem of hunger is not a production problem, it's an access problem. It's getting entitlement to food, not producing food, that's the problem.
The resistance to globalization is that it stems from the insights of some people that, you know, the corporations, they want to be able to go in and make the money, but they don't want responsibility when things don't work out.
One of the most ironic parts of the fact that the biotechnology industry is saying that it's going to feed the world is that it has created a new technology called Terminator technology. And this technology is basically a suicide gene that's put into crops, so after one planting, they commit suicide. You cannot save the seed because the seed then is sterile. It will lead to no crops in the next season. There's 15 patents by first world companies on this suicide technology. Can you imagine what is going to happen if that suicide gene pollutes crops around the world?
A few years earlier, a lot of people were saying, well, won't these technologies outcross into all species? And the promoters said, no, 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 there will be no outcrossing. And then just in a few short years, they were back saying, well, okay, there is outcrossing, but now we have a new technology that'll help deal with that. And this, of course, raises the question, well, what about outcrossing of the Terminator gene?
They are also developing trader technology so that a farmer has to spray his field with proprietary chemical in order for seeds to germinate and grow.
We have the potential of ending up with green deserts where you don't see the difference. You know, the environment will continue to be green, but it is being transformed from inside. And when that cracks, when that monoculture breaks down, it's going to be very massive.